Welcome, this is Brianne Lowe, State Biologist with the Indiana USDA NRCS. This is Module 5 of a 6-part series on the use of Indiana's Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. Modules within this series cover a variety of habitat types that one may encounter when evaluating and planning wildlife habitat in Indiana. If you have not viewed Module 1, Overview of the WHEG, I encourage you to start there prior to diving into the land cover module. In this module, we will look at an area that was formerly crop ground but will be being converted into woody cover. We are looking at this area up in the northeast portion of the screen where some brushy cover will be added to a bottomland area. This is a landowner farmstead to the north, and they are interested in converting what was former crop ground down in this bottomland into a wooded wildlife habitat. As you can see, it is already growing up some in this area, and therefore the cropland that was there in the past is no longer functioning and would be difficult to maintain. The parcel is approximately 8 acres. The trees that are currently present on site are silver maple, cottonwood, willow, sycamore, and elderberry. The interest of the landowner is to increase the wildlife value of the habitat by planting more soft mass such as plums and hawthorn and hard mass such as hickory or oaks for the acorns. Only about 200 feet on the west edge of this parcel is exposed to the adjacent field, which is actually the field where we talked about the quail border earlier in the modules. With all the existing trees here, that will be protection from drift as well, but given the size of this parcel, we know that more than half the acreage is more than 250 feet away from this small opening. So therefore, the majority of this parcel will be protected from pesticide drift. So again, we're looking at planting brush and trees in this bottomland acre, totaling 8 acres, greater than 300 feet across, with the interest in wildlife habitat. So let's dive into the WHEG itself. This time, we will be using the Associated Ag wood-dominated WHEG. As in the past, the top is filled out with the landowner's interest, and we will begin by going through the various factors. The parcel itself, as mentioned, was already 8 acres. That cannot change, and it will not change, so we're at that 0.6 as existing habitat, and we will maintain the 0.6 into the future. The width on all sides is greater than 300 feet. The plant composition. Here is a case where we need to be evaluating what is already out on site. As I mentioned before, there is a number of existing silver maple, cottonwood, willow, sycamore, the various softwood species that tend to quickly colonize an area when it comes out of production. There are some invasive species out there, some of the shrubby invasives, Amur honeysuckle, autumn olive. So right now, 50% or more of the mix is in that mostly native category. We plan to add more to it into the future, and so we will increase that. And then we will also talk about any brush management that may or may not occur on site. So we know that moving out, if the landowner is intending to do some brush management and we're going to add more species, native species out there, that we're going to jump that score up. You would evaluate this specifically based on what you see on site. The vegetative species richness is looking at how many different species that you see out there. So this is specifically related to the trees and shrubs that are on site, since this is the wood dominated and the end goal is a wood dominated situation. As stated earlier, those softwoods have moved in. So we're looking at about 5 or 6 native species that are out on site now. With the various species we plan to add, we're going to jump to that 7 to 10 category. Maybe higher if the landowner wants to plant an even greater diversity out on site. For the mass producing species, we don't intend for anyone to do detailed plot estimate of what is occurring on the site. What we want to know is if more than 20% or at least 20% of the trees are mass producing. Mass includes soft mass, which are the soft fruited species such as plum, black cherry, hackberry, the brambles, native roses, etc. These are the soft fruits that everyone can think of. They provide some early food. They're a nutritious source for wildlife, but they do not last through the winter. Hard mass species include nut trees such as black walnut, hickories, and oaks. Those species tend to produce their food later in the year, and that food lasts over the winter. So having a mix of both is important and has different value to different species. Soft mass species also tend to be more favored by the pollinators, and the hard massed species have a variable value to pollinators overall. So again, having that mix provides different benefit to different species. When out on site, the easiest way to do this is just take a really rough estimate of counting the trees, and if 1 out of every 5 trees you count out there is a mast producing tree, then you've at least reached that 20%. And then look at how that breakdown occurs by soft and hard mast. Hard mast is very important to get through those winter months, so it does incorporate a little more value on here, but it is important to have a mix of both. So right now, given the species we have out there, only the elderberry is providing any real soft mast for the species. There's not a whole lot of hard mast out there. So while there's a lot of elderberry, it does produce soft mast. There are no hard mast present. So we're going to be looking at this category D. At least 20% of the trees or shrubs produce soft mast, and no hard mast is present. We plan to add some additional soft mast species out there depending on the site suitability and the space we have, as well as some hard mast. So we are going to jump that up to at least a minimum of 4 mast producing species, depending on what species we incorporate out there. So let's jump that up to a 0.75. It may even jump up to a 1, depending on how many species you ultimately settle upon with the landowner. As discussed in that site description, we have the pesticide-free setback that is definitely greater than 250 feet, protecting more than 50% of the property. Of course, with the trees, there's probably even a greater percentage of the property protected. While for the purposes of the WHEG, there's no requirement to actually calculate the impact of trees or hedgerows in protecting from that pesticide-free setback. Please feel free to use other tools at your disposal to do those calculations if that is important to making this score more accurate. But again, we want this to be very general and just looking out there and seeing how the setting impacts these various factors. In this case, as we said during the intro, greater than 50% is protected by more than 250 feet of setback. So that does not change no matter benchmark or plant. Invasive species, there are some invasive shrubs out on the site, about 20% coverage, so we will start with that 0.25. If the landowner has no intention to control that, you would leave that at the 0.25. If they do intend to control it, in this case, we will go with it. They are. You can change that score. If there is a lot of invasive species off the property and you don't think they will be able to get full control, feel free to leave it at the 0.5, at least getting it to our minimum planting criteria with any brush management option. But if this is an isolated site or there is just a few species out there or few individual plants, it may be possible to get 100% control. So then in that instance, a 1.0 would be a responsible option. In the structures for wildlife, again, looking at the various cover types that are out there. Are there cavities in the trees? Are they going to add trees? Are they adding bunch grasses or anything like that? In this case, because we're only planting trees out on the site, we aren't really changing anything in terms of bunch grasses as we have used in the past several modules. With the trees that are there, this would be a chance to look at, would girdling a tree to provide some snag or cavity in the tree be an option? Or are there some existing cavities or snags available? So let's just consider that there is a tree with a cavity out there. So we're starting out with one structure from that nesting habitat, but perhaps we're going to girdle a tree and add some additional snags. for some roosting and perching cover out there. So the landowner has decided to girdle some of those softwoods to reduce the numbers, and we can jump that up to a 0.5. It can vary. That score may not change very much for our typical landowners that are doing this, but we do want to encourage some of these additional practices we have, such as edge feathering or the use of brush piles or other woody debris to increase habitat value for some of the species that we target around the state. So in this instance, we are actually getting a relatively high benchmark score compared to what we've looked at in the other modules, 0.44. And then the primary habitat score that we're planning is jumping up to that 0.71. So again, there is a numeric increase. Even if this had been at a 0.5, there would be that numeric increase. And in fact, we'll look at how that is viewed by changing some of these categories in a little bit. So from the food resources standpoint, so from up above, we looked at that mass score. So in the previous modules, this looked at the species richness, but now we're really looking at that mass factor. And then the food plots available. Now we already know that there's no food plots out there now, so regardless of that mass factor, we know that that's going to be a 0. But let's say the landowner is interested in putting in a 1/10 of an acre food plot. We can go up and look at where our planned massed species are, and it's at that 0.75, so we're over those 0.5. And the landowner has said that they are going to install a 1/2 acre food plot. That provides an opportunity to jump up this food resources score to a 1. However, what this does do is actually detracts from the rest of the habitat. So by putting in a 1/2 acre of food plot in a 6 acre field, and I'm going to jump back to the map just to kind of take a look at this. So in this field here, this is 6 acres total. If the landowner is going to put in a 1/2 acre food plot here, that's actually a reduction in the habitat acres. We are not going to include the food plot in the habitat acres because there's a risk of invasive species in those areas. The disturbance to the soil can be quite significant in food plot areas depending on how the landowners manage it and what equipment they have available to them. So that actually does play back into these initial WHEG scores. So right now we are at 6 acres. A 1/2 acre doesn't change the score below that 0.6. But let's say the landowner wanted to do a 1.5 acre food plot in this area. That would be a rare instance where you would actually reduce the plant score. So for a 1/2 acre food plot, there would be no change. But for a 1.5 acre food plot, oh, I'm sorry, this starts with 8 acres. I was thinking 6. If this score had dropped significantly, so if we had gone from 8 acres down to 5, or if we had started at 5 and dropped down to 4, there may be a change in that benchmark score. I apologize, I had different acreage in mind. But overall, that is one instance where the size of the habitat overall can change. In this case, the landowner does not have any cover crops. The proposed habitat is surrounded on one side that the landowner controls by perennial cover. In that instance, you can actually go ahead and give them a 1. They do not have control over the other areas. So in this case, it really doesn't change for them. They're not able to do anything to any other habitat, just their farmstead, which does have that perennial cover buffering that bottom land area. Again, you kind of use your judgment on what is out there and what they have access to, because what they are able to control is never tilled. It's that sort of wooded area along their farmstead. They get 1s in both of these categories. And their pest management techniques, they will get a 0. They don't have any IPM, doesn't really impact them. It's also not ultimately going to impact their score by very much. You can see you got the benchmark score from the top for that primary habitat of fair in their plan score of excellent, so it was a pretty sizable jump there. And then even though with the landscape habitat factors, we jumped up to a good, we still are at that excellent. So that primary habitat score did increase from fair to excellent. And with the ranking, we would have that same excellent score. But you can see there is some impact by that surrounding land use on both that benchmark and the landscape score. So that is an example of using the woody habitat evaluation guide. Again, we don't want this to be daunting, so just use very general estimates when out on site and visiting with the landowner and using their target goals and keeping them in mind. Plots are not necessary as part of this as they would be for a forest management plan. This is just a site that is general woody cover that would not be managed as a forest. In our last and final module, we will look at an example of existing herbaceous cover that is going to be revived or managed, such as an existing CRP. Thank you.